Alright, so because the starter replacement on the E36 can be such a nightmare, it is best to make sure you have all of your tools kind of prepared before you get going, because you never know which of the two methods is going to work from you, whether you can actually if you're going to take the intake manifold off and try to loosen the bolts from the top, or if you are going to go the other method, which is to jack the car up, drop the transmission cross member, and to let the engine and transmission sag a little bit, and then you jack up the front of the engine a little bit to tilt it backwards, so you can get a long extension up from the transmission tunnel to reach the back of the bolts that way. But it's best when beginning this job to make sure you can do it both ways, because you never know how it's going to go. So these are the tools that I use. I'm going to try to break it down into a couple different steps here. So first thing, you want to have your E12 sockets. Looking like these guys here. I found, by the way, these both need to be in the 3/8 size. I found that the longer one was too long. There was not enough room between the bolt head and the firewall, so I had to rely on this shorter one here. You also want to make sure you have two 3/8 swivel sockets here, and a whole variety of 3/8 extensions. Additionally, if you don't have one, you're going to want to go buy an E12 box end wrench set. This one I had to bend in a couple locations just so it would fit and I could actually reach it, because access is just so tight back there. So maybe also be prepared to have a way to bend this. I use a vise and a hammer. And also, just as a backup, you don't have to do it. I went out and bought two brand new bolts from BMW because I saw one of them was already starting to get chewed up, and the other one, which is somewhere back in there, I had started to round off even more before I was able to get it off. So I'm not about to put some rounded off bolts back in my car. I just got some fresh new ones. Not the end of the world. So that's kind of what you need to break the bolts loose. I'm not going to go into how to remove your intake manifold or how to drop your transmission cross member. The cross member is pretty easy. It's just 4 13mm bolts. And then, you got to undo the electrical connectors on the back of the solenoid. And if you're like me and your car hasn't been apart in a while, or you have lots of rust and dirt and stuff, you're going to have to use some tools to get the starter off that centering pin there. Definitely want to spray it with some penetrating oil first, both from the back here where you can kind of get to it, and from the top to let the penetrating oil work in there. I used a variety of tools, different pry bars and flathead screwdrivers and a hammer and whatever that brass driver is, to kind of try to break things loose a little bit. It probably helped, but really what seemed to do the trick was the penetrating oil and just wiggling it back and forth with your hands. And that tape down there also reminded me of a trick that I used. So when I was breaking the bolts loose from underneath the car, which is what I had to do for one of them that I just couldn't get to from the top, you're fishing a long extension up from underneath the car. Oh, and you are also going to need a helper if you're going to be doing the under the car method, because someone from the top is going to need to make sure that your socket actually gets lined up square and true on the bolt. So you make sure you don't round it off. It's got to be fully seated because these E12 bolts suck. But anyway, so you know, one person is under the car feeding this through above the transmission in the transmission tunnel up to the back of the bolt. I was having a problem where, you know, my wobble joint was flopping all around and it was getting stuck because there's so little room. I ended up wrapping the U-joint here, the wobble joint, in tape, and also I taped the socket to it. So basically, when I was pushing this through up from the bottom, it was just one nice long straight piece. And then once it was kind of up there, my helper was able to, you know, the tape was pretty easy to break. And then it basically turned back into a wobble when I was ready for it to actually wobble. So that was a little trick I came up with. Another note, breaking those bolts loose. It's all going to depend on how tight they were put on there, how long they've been on there, how much rust and corrosion you have, and all that stuff. I initially tried to break them both loose from the bottom of the car. I was also initially using both wobble joints here and more extensions. That's not how I ended up doing it. I found that the two wobble joints in this 3-foot long piece of extension, they just had too much give. There is too much slack in them. So if I was trying to break the bolts loose with like a breaker bar or anything like that, there just wasn't enough room for me to manipulate the breaker bar under the car. So I started trying to break things loose with my day-to-day impact here. Use it for 99% of my jobs. At the time, my big boy was loaned out to a friend. This guy would not break stuff loose. I was hammering on it, wouldn't do it. When I got the big boy back, I'd already removed one of the bolts with this guy, the easier one to get to, but the one kind of on top in this, you know, more of the center line of the vehicle was started to round off, and this wasn't going on it. So basically I had to get under the car, do the long extension method, really just this, I don't know if this is an 18-inch bar or what, and this guy here, I kind of used a hammer at the back of here to hammer this on to the somewhat rounded off bolt head there. I got it on, and then this guy got it off in probably about 10 seconds of banging. So it works, but man, you better be prepared for the worst when you do this job. I've got a pretty decent tool set. I had to go out and buy this this wrench set for the E12. I mean, it was a set, but I didn't have those. Had to go get them. Ended up having to buy the new bolts midway through because I knew I didn't want to reuse the crap that was on the car. So go in here planning for your car to be down for quite some time. You may not have as many troubles as I did. Your bolts may not be as tight. But you know, this is a pretty shit job. So you know, it's out, but really hoping I don't have to do this again. But I'm hoping that if you kind of plan ahead, you know what you're getting into, you have the right tools, you have a game plan, you have a helper. It's doable, but it's definitely one of the least pleasant, you know, quote unquote easy jobs that you can do on this car. So yeah, hope that's helpful. All right, so I am trying to torque, or at least tighten the bolts for the starter. Again, really struggling to get access from the top, so I'm going to do everything from the bottom again here. I didn't think I was going to show this, but I might as well. the way you do this is you very carefully jack the front of the oil pan up. Again, being careful not to touch the crank or the steering rack or anything else. Jack it up with something soft after disconnecting the 4 bolts for the transmission brace back there. You can see mine hanging down. I have an aftermarket brace. So once that is loose, you can then jack up the front of the engine here, and that will start tilting stuff back so you can run those 3/8 extensions over top of the transmission up into the bolts. So I figured I'd show this while I was down here.